Hello everyone. Today's topic is hypoxia. We're gonna to discuss next aims. The definition and classification of hypoxia, the main reasons and causes. Also, we will talk about the compensatory mechanisms in case of hypoxia and damaging pathological mechanisms that can make an injury to the body in case of hypoxia. And of course, we will discuss the main consequences, the meaning of hypoxia, and so on. So, hypoxia can be considered as one of the most common pathological processes, and it's also associated with inflammation. On this slide, you can see that we have a lot of examples when hypoxia is in the basis of inflammatory conditions, because, for example, one of the vascular reaction in case of inflammation is a vasoconstriction and local ischemia, which will lead to hypoxia. On another hand, we have the hypoxia as a consequence of inflammation. For example, it can be inflammation in the lungs due to some infectious process, pneumonia will be characterized by hypoxia. It can be also hypoxia in cardiomyocytes in case of ischemic heart disease and myocardial infarction development. So it will be accompanied by inflammation, and inflammation will have the hypoxia. So it's important to understand the mechanisms and processes that are observed in case of hypoxia for any kind of doctor. Um, what is the definition of hypoxia? Hypoxia is inadequate oxygen supply to body tissues or disturbed oxygen consumption or utilization. So when there is not enough oxygen for cells, it's called hypoxia. At times it could be the situation when we have enough oxygen, but our cells cannot use it, cannot utilize. So it will be also hypoxia. We will discuss all this situation a bit later. Also, some related terms we need to elucidate. They are related, they are connected to hypoxia, but they are not the same. So the next one you can see is hypoxemia, which literally means lack of oxygen in the blood, right? And it's decreased partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. It's of course, when we don't have enough oxygen in the blood, it will lead to general consequences, general hypoxia, but it's just a name of the indicator in the blood, not the typical pathological process which is characterized by inadequate oxygen supply or inadequate utilization of oxygen, and just something we can see in blood test, hypoxemia. And hypoxia, it's more general, more wide definition because it includes some compensatory mechanism and damaging mechanism. Also, sometimes we can bump into the dyspnea term, which is subjective experience of breathing discomfort or sensation of lack of or excess of air in the lungs. And sometimes it can be the sign of hypoxia, but it's not the same, right? It's like a feeling, sensation when we don't have enough oxygen or don't have enough air, or we have feeling of excessive air in the lungs. So to understand what are the reasons, what are the mechanisms and consequences of hypoxia, we need to brush up some knowledge from the normal physiology, and of course we need to understand the pathway of the oxygen from the atmospheric air that we inhale into the lungs. Then the oxygen will go through the aerohematical barrier, right, into the vessels, then will be circulating and will be supplied to the cells. So as you can see on this slide, general representation of gas exchange in alveoli, and the main moving force for gas exchange, oxygen consumption, and CO2 emission will be the partial pressure of these gases in different spaces, right? You can see that the atmospheric air contains about 100 milliliters hydrogram of the oxygen, and the oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen in the vessels, in the capillaries, it's about 40 milliliters hydrogram. So the moving force will be pointed towards the vessels, from the alveoli into the vessels, because 140. And after oxygenation, the oxygenated arterial blood will have almost the same concentration of oxygen, which is also 100 milliliters hydrogram, right? And it will be distributed into systemic circulation. On another hand, as a end product of metabolic processes, our cells produce the carbon dioxide, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in venous part of capillaries, it's about 47, like you can see here at the slide, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in alveolar air is 40. So the moving force will be pointed into the alveoli, and we will uh, exhale the CO2 from the body, right? You can see the my explanation on this slide. When we uh, got the oxygen into the vessels from the alveolar air, we can talk about content of oxygen in the blood. How much oxygen do we have in the blood, right? So it's important to understand, because if we say that hypoxia, it's a decreased oxygen supply, decreased level of oxygen in the body, right? And the consequences of this decrease, we need to understand how much oxygen is in the blood, what is the content of oxygen. And you can see the general equation, the formula for evaluation of oxygen content in the blood. Of course, it depends on the hemoglobin concentration, because we know that hemoglobin is a specific protein inside the erythrocytes that will um, that carries the oxygen, and also we need to take into account the coefficient, which is 1.34 milliliters of oxygen per 1 gram of hemoglobin. So it means that 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 milliliters of oxygen, right? So but we know that not all molecules of hemoglobin are carrying the oxygen in some moment of time, right? So we need to take into account the ratio, the portion of oxyhemoglobin, which is binded hemoglobin with oxygen, right? And this indicator is saturation, which is an average percentage of oxygen bound to hemoglobin in the red blood cells. And you can see that it will depend, the saturation meaning will depend on level of oxyhemoglobin and deoxygenated hemoglobin, right? So, and some portion of oxygen can be saturated in the plasma, but solubility of the oxygen is low as a physical property. We have the coefficient 0.003 milliliters per millimeter hydrogram of oxygen per deciliter of blood, right? So the coefficient of saturation, and it represents solubility of the oxygen in the blood. So according to this equation, we can get the exact content of oxygen in the blood, right? So On the right side of the slide, you can see this pathway, the journey of the oxygen from the inhaled air into the cells through the alveoli, through the red blood cells bounded with hemoglobin, and then again through the interstitial fluid into the cells. And now we can, understanding this pathway, this journey of oxygen, we can understand the main principles of classification, right? But of course, as general principles, according to the clinical course, any kind of hypoxia can be acute and chronic. According to the prevalence, it can be local or general, systemic, right? Hypoxia of whole body or hypoxia in some site of inflammation, for example. And according to the etiology, according to the reason, according to the level of problem, it can be hypoxic or exogenous hypoxia when there is no oxygen in the air, right? Exogenous problem. We will discuss some exact examples a bit later. Respiratory hypoxia, which represents the problem on the lung level, respiratory system, right? Circulatory hypoxia, the oxygen is not delivered by cardiovascular system, right? It can be some heart disease, it can be vascular pathology, and so on. Hemic hypoxia or blood hypoxia, when we have problem with red blood cells. The cells that should carry the oxygen. For example, if it's not enough cells, lack of erythrocytes, or some problems with hemoglobin, it will lead to impaired delivery of oxygen, right? And also will be hypoxia. Tissue or histotoxic, sorry, hypoxia means that situation when we have the delivery of oxygen, lungs are functioning okay, cardiovascular system is functioning okay, but our cells cannot utilize the oxygen because of some problems with, for example, oxidation, the metabolic processes inside the cell. Right? And of course, it can be a combination of different types, which is mixed hypoxia. On the right side of the slide, you can see a general picture that represents this journey of the oxygen, and it's easy to imagine different levels and different types from environment, outside, exogenous type, then lung, then vessels, and red blood cells, and then peripheral tissues and cells of different levels: exogenous, respiratory, circulatory, blood, tissue, and can be mixed. Here it's a general chart with characteristic of type that we mentioned before, and some clinical examples where when we can observe these types of hypoxia. And so exogenous hypoxic hypoxia is characterized by decreased partial pressure of oxygen, saturation of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is also decreased, right? It's important characteristic which will be which is distinguishes this type of hypoxia from another types, because in case of decreased oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen, the compensatory mechanism will be activation of ventilation. We will discuss these mechanisms a bit later, and we will have hyperventilation with washing out the carbon dioxide. It will be excessive elimination of CO2 from the body, and that's why partial pressure of CO2 in most of cases of hypoxia is decreased. And it will also lead to respiratory alkalosis due to hyperventilation. Lack of CO2 will lead to lack of carbonic acid, which is main acid of hydrocarbonate buffer system, right? And that's why it will be alkalosis. The pH will be increased. Also, it will be characterized by spasm of cerebral arteries, so-called high-altitude cerebral edema and high-altitude pulmonary edema. And these are the most dangerous complication of so-called mountain disease. As you can see in part of examples, it's mentioned at the first place, right? Mountain disease, high-altitude disease, or lack of oxygen in some closed locked chambers, right? It can be, for example, on the submarine without adequate air ventilation, right? So when there is no oxygen, enough oxygen concentration in the air. A respiratory type of hypoxia is characterized by also decreased partial pressure of oxygen, hypoxemia, decreased saturation of oxygen, increased carbon dioxide concentration, which is called hypercapnia. And as a result of hypercapnia, it will be respiratory acidosis. Why is it happening in this case? Because in first type hypoxic hypoxia, we didn't have a problem with the lungs or with the heart, right? Initial problem. The problem is in the air. And because of hyperventilation, it will be decreasing concentration of CO2. Here we have problem with the respiratory system. We have a problem with the lungs. So lungs are not able to uh, oxygenate the blood and to get rid of the CO2, right? So it will be lack of O2 and accumulation of CO2, hypercapnia. And of course, if we have a lot of CO2, we will have a lot of carbonic acid, and it will lead to respiratory acidosis, right? Acidity will be increased, pH will be decreased. And the main effect of acidosis will be dilation of cerebral arteries. We'll discuss about this mechanism a bit later, but for general characteristic, we have mentioned this now. And as I have told you, this respiratory hypoxia can be observed in any kind of respiratory failure. Can be due to ventilation disorders. It can be due to diffusional or perfusional disorders, and can be almost any kind of respiratory system disease, pneumonia, tuberculosis, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or bronchial asthma, and so on. So it will be characterized by respiratory hypoxia. Next one is circulatory hypoxia or cardiovascular hypoxia, which is which can be observed due to systemic or local circulation disorders, right? Systemic is due to heart failure or hemodynamics changes, some critical such as a shock situation, and local when we have ischemia, diminished blood supply because of obstruction of artery or because of spasm of artery or congestion when it's compressed, right? So it will lead to the decrease of blood supply, and of course we will have less oxygen, and it will be circulatory hypoxia. And you can see the main characteristic of this type, which is arterial venous oxygen difference, increased arterial venous oxygen difference, right? It's the difference between partial pressure of oxygen in arteries and in veins, right? So we know that in arteries it should be around 100 milliliters. In the veins it can be around 45, 47 milliliter. I'm sorry, 40. It's around 40 milliliters. So in case of this situation, when we don't have adequate blood circulation, the tissues will take more oxygen, from the blood, and in the venous blood, the concentration of oxygen will be decreased. less oxygen than in normal situation. So the difference between arterial and vein blood oxygen concentration will be increased, and this is called arterial venous oxygen difference. Saturation of oxygen will be decreased, of course, and it will this situation will lead to metabolic acidosis, which is accumulation of lactic acid, lactate, right? Because in case of hypoxic situation, our peripheral tissues, our cells, will try to survive in the situation, in the condition without oxygen, by activation of anaerobic glycolysis, right? When we don't use the oxygen, it's not so effective way to produce ATP, but it's better than nothing, right? But unfortunately, the end product of anaerobic glycolysis is lactate, and accumulation of lactate will lead to metabolic non-respiratory acidosis, right? Increased acidity, decreased pH. Next one is hemic or blood hypoxia. It's a hypoxia due to some problems with the blood. On one hand, it can be problems with the red blood cells, number of red blood cells count can be decreased in case of anemia or erythropenia, right? It can be due to blood loss, hemorrhage, bleeding, or due to hemolysis when it's destruction of the erythrocytes in the vessels or in the spleen. On another hand, we can have normal number of erythrocytes, normal level of erythrocyte count, but we can have inactivated or blocked or mutated, damaged hemoglobin. The problem with hemoglobin, not with erythrocytes number, right? It can be pathological types of hemoglobin or inactivation, for example, by CO2, carbon monoxide poisoning. And the main characteristic are represented in the chart. It's decreased level of hemoglobin, right? If it's anemia, and decreased level of saturation, of course. But we can have normal level of oxygen in the plasma. So partial pressure of oxygen can be normal, right? Because it's a problem there is no problem with circulation, there is no problem with respiration. The problem with the erythrocytes, with hemoglobin, and another part of oxygen which can be uh, saturated in the blood plasma, soluble, which is very small portion, but anyway, will be normal. And of course, we also will have metabolic acidosis as a result of activation of anaerobic glycolysis as a mechanism of surviving of cells, right? And the last one, a type of hypoxia, which is tissue or histotoxic hypoxia, is a hypoxia in case of inactivation of respiratory chain enzymes in our mitochondria when we have where we have oxidative phosphorylation for ATP production, right? The specific system of the enzymes, they can be damaged, they can be inactivated by some toxins, by some chemicals and drugs. For example, like you can see, it's dinitrophenol, and it will uncouple oxidation from phosphorylation. So in the situation when oxygen is consumpted, but there is no production of ATP, right? And also can be damaging for the cell. Or it can be inactivation by some poisons, right? For example, like cyanides and so on. Okay, we can move on. Here, some more characteristics of acute mountain disease as an example of hypoxic or exogenous hypoxia, when we have lack of oxygen in the air. So when we are climbing in the mountains, ascending in the mountains, the level of oxygen will be progressively decreasing, right? And what we will have hypoxic hypoxia, lack of oxygen in the air, and as a result, it will be hyperventilation because lack of oxygen will be sensed by our chemoreceptors in aortic arch, carotid sinuses, right? And they will activate the respiratory center in the brainstem, and it will lead to hyperventilation and washing out the carbon dioxide, hypocapnia, it's called, the decreased concentration of CO2, partial pressure of CO2, and respiratory alkalosis as a result, right? As a result of respiratory alkalosis and the effect of respiratory alkalosis, it will be a constriction, can be constriction of the cerebral arteries and dilation of peripheral arteries. But also when we're talking about uh, acute mountain disease in general, we need to take into account another negative effects that can affect the human body in high in the mountains, right? So it also can be the results of negative effects of radiation, negative effects of decreased barometric pressure, atmospheric pressure, right? It's like a decompression condition. It can be expansion of the air in the sinuses, in the middle ear, in the intestine, right? Also, it can be decreased humidity, decreased temperature, right? So influence of low temperature and other physical factors. And altogether, it will be the full picture of acute mountain disease. Also, the interesting complications that can be observed in case of acute mountain disease, it's pulmonary hypertension. It can happen to the person if the height of the mountains is more 2,500 meters on average. So we have like a situation when the pulmonary arteries will be constricted. It will be spasm of pulmonary artery. It's called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, or which will lead to hypoxic pulmonary hypertension. It can be explained by specific ion channels, potassium, oxygen sensitive channels in these pulmonary arteries. And when the level of oxygen will be decreased, they will be closed, inactivated, because oxygen activates them and they are open. And if there is no oxygen, the potassium channels will be closed. It will lead to depolarization of the smooth muscles of pulmonary arteries. Depolarization will activate calcium channels. The calcium will go inside the cells. Calcium influx will cause contraction and spasm, right? So smooth muscles contraction will lead to pulmonary hypertension. It will be one of the type of pulmonary hypertension in case of mountain disease. Also, life-threatening complications of acute mountain disease can be high-altitude pulmonary edema and high-altitude cerebral edema. So the first one is pulmonary edema, which can sound paradoxal, right? Because we just mentioned that it will be pulmonary hypertension because of vasoconstriction, and in most of cases, we have pulmonary edema when we have vasodilation, right, and a lot of fluid, and it will be edema, leakage of the plasma into the alveoli. In this case, the pathogenesis is unclear, but scientists suggest that it can be some stress, endothelial stress failure, and leakage of the plasma through the endovascular wall on the level of arterioles, not on the level of capillaries, but arterioles. Maybe it will be like literal some cracks because of this uh, huge spasm constriction, and some plasma will leak through these cracks, through these holes, and damage endothelial because of high pressure. Because you know that pulmonary vessels are vessels of low pressure. They are not used to keep to maintain this high pressure, so they can be easily damaged, and it will lead to the pulmonary edema. One more factor of pulmonary edema is lack of oxygen, which will lead to hypoxia of alveolar epithelial cells, right? And we know that lack of oxygen will lead to depletion of ATP, and depletion of ATP will impair the functioning of the sodium-potassium pump, right? So sodium-potassium pump will work improperly, and it will lead to decrease of sodium gradient in alveolar wall, and also will may lead to accumulation of liquid, because normally we have sodium potassium pump on the basal membrane of alveolocytes and sodium channels on the apical membrane. So working of the sodium potassium pump will lead to this like sucking of the sodium from alveoli space into the blood. In the case of hypoxia, this mechanism will be blocked, and it will also lead to edema. When we are talking about high altitude cerebral edema, we need to understand that the reactions of cerebral vessels to hypoxia in case of high altitude syndrome or acute mountain disease can be different. And I have mentioned that it can be also constriction, which will lead to ischemia. And you know that ischemia will damage the vascular wall, and hematoencephalic the barrier, right? So it's one possible factor. Another factor, it will be accumulation of so-called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor. We will discuss it about a bit later. And it also has the ability to increase permeability of vessels. So that if the vessels, cerebral vessels permeability is increased, we will have the leakage of plasma into the tissue, brain tissue, which will lead to cerebral edema. And of course, when we don't have oxygen in general for all cells, brain cells also will be suffering, right? And if their potassium, sodium potassium channel in the neurons is not working properly, right, it will be accumulation of sodium inside the cell, like osmotic mechanism of injury, and it will lead to moving of water from extracellular space into the cell, into the intracellular space, and it will lead to the swelling of neurons. So we'll actually, in case of high altitude cerebral edema, we will have mixed mechanism of cerebral edema, which is vasogenic, increased permeability, and cytotoxic, the swelling in intracellular edema, which is called swelling. So this is also a life-threatening complication that can lead to the death, unfortunately. Here we can see the example of chocolate brown blood in case of increased meth hemoglobin concentration. On the right, it's like dark brown chocolate blood. On the left is normal sample of the blood. And this slide illustrates the hemic hypoxia due to inactivation of the hemoglobin, right? If you remember the previous chart, it was hemic hypoxia can be the result of loss of red blood cells, lack of red blood cells, anemia, and it will lead to decreased oxygen capacity of the blood. If there is no erythrocyte, nobody can carry the oxygen, right? So because of lack of hemoglobin. On another hand, hemic hypoxia can be the result of inactivation of hemoglobin. Normal count of red blood cells, normal concentration of hemoglobin, but this hemoglobin is not functioning properly. It can be inactivated, And one of example is meth hemoglobin, which is oxidated hemoglobin. When the iron as a component of hemoglobin will change the charge from ferrum 2 plus into ferrum 3 plus. So ferrous iron will be oxidated into ferric iron, and this ferrum 3 plus iron is not able to be bounded with the oxygen, and the ability to carry the oxygen will be decreased, so it's blocked, inactivated, right? It can happen in case of poisoning by some pro-oxidants, the chemicals or drugs that can lead to formation of free radicals, a lot of oxidative stress, right? And iron will be oxidated and inactivated. And also, it can be in case of poisoning by nitrates, right? So, and other oxidants. Sometimes it can be some congenital disease. For example, in case of glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase mutation, we will have the weakness of antioxidant system in the erythrocytes, and they will be easily destroyed even by hemolysis in case of uh, taking some pro-oxidant pills or even some food that can increase the production of free radicals, right? We know that free radicals are being produced constantly, even in physiological condition, but in low concentration, and they can act as secondary messengers as well. But if it's too much of production of free radicals, it can destroy erythrocytes, or it can produce meth hemoglobin and inactivate hemoglobin. Another classical example of inactivation of hemoglobin is a formation of complex with carbon monoxide, which is called carboxyhemoglobin, right? Carboxyhemoglobin. It's a complex with CO monoxide with the hemoglobin. CO has a much higher affinity to the hemoglobin compared to the oxygen. So this hemoglobin will be blocked by CO, and oxygen will not be able to attach to the hemoglobin and be carried to the tissues, right? So it can happen to person in case of some fires, some burning of fuels, right? So in case of some accidents and so on. So it was in examples of hemic hypoxia, right? Anemias and inactivation. I didn't mention the examples of cardiovascular or circulatory hypoxia, but you had the chart. It can be heart failure due to injury, some ischemic heart disease, myocardial infarction, cardiosclerosis. It can be some defects or insufficiency of some mitral or tricuspidal valves and so on. A lot of problems with heart. You will have these topics next semester. Here we have the picture of respiratory enzymes chain, and we are talking about tissue or histotoxic hypoxia. When we have enough oxygen in the blood, we have enough oxygen in the air, our lungs and our heart is functioning properly, right? But our tissues, our cells are not able to to utilize this oxygen because of destruction, damaging of the enzymes we need for oxidative phosphorylation, or because they're inactivation. And you can see the specific examples, which are CO, again, monoxide. So monoxide, carbon monoxide has several damaging effects. It's blockage of the hemoglobin, inactivation of hemoglobin by formation of carboxyhemoglobin, and also inactivation of complex 4 of respiratory chain enzymes, right? Cytochrome oxidase, complex 4, and it will block the production of ATP, energy supply, right? So it will lead to ATP depletion and all the consequences. So CO and cyanides, right? Cyanides also have these effects. One more example of tissue hypoxia can be some hormones or some drugs that can uncouple oxidation and phosphorylation when the oxygen will be used in these chains, respiratory chain, but there is no production of ATP. So we have oxidation, but we don't have phosphorylation of ADP with ATP production, right? So it will also lead to ATP depletion and can be life-threatening for the cell, right? So example of these uncoupling chemicals could be hormones, high concentration of thyroid hormones. Thyroxine can uncouple this oxidation and phosphorylation, leading to increasing of temperature, all right, hypothermia. Okay, the next slide represents the compensatory mechanism. Now we know what are the main types, what are the main characteristics and examples of each type of hypoxia, right? And now we need to understand what is happening in case of hypoxia, what are the compensatory mechanisms, and what are the damaging mechanisms in case of decompensated hypoxia, right? Because we have a general approach when we have compensation stage and compensatory mechanism, and decompensation stage, proper damaging mechanisms, right? Pathological mechanisms. In case of compensation stage, as a reaction, as a response to decreased oxygen level, accumulation of CO2, if it's, for example, respiratory hypoxia, right? Or acidosis in case of cardiovascular hypoxia, hemic hypoxia. It will be activation of receptors, chemoreceptors, as I have mentioned before, and activation of respiratory center, which will lead to hyperventilation. It will be increase of depth of the breathing and breathing rate, right? So also it will be activation of cardiac function, right? Increased cardiac output, accelerated heart rate, increased blood pressure, all effects of catecholamines actually, right? Because as a response in case of hypoxia, it will be activation of stress systems, and it will lead to activation of sympathetic nervous system with catecholamines release, and they will activate the heart function, constrict the vessels, and we will have these effects. Of course, the activation of sympathetic nervous system will also lead to release of blood from the depot, first of all from the spleen because of constriction of spleen capsule. On the molecular level, we can also mention the shift of oxygen binding curve, right, which represent affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen, depending on different factors, right? So it will be shift to the right, which means that the hemoglobin will lose affinity and will easily release the oxygen to the tissue, which can be helpful, right, in the situation of lack of oxygen. On local effect, it can be vasodilation, because of accumulation of some lactic acid, because of anaerobic glycolysis, right? Also, it's because of accumulation of ADP and adenosine, accumulation of some another acids, hypercapnia, CO2, increased concentration also have this effect on peripheral vessels. We're not talking about central vessels such as cerebral vessels or coronary vessels or pulmonary vessels, right? Because they are specific, but another peripheral vessels, if there is a high concentration of CO2, accumulation of lactic acids, and another organic acids, it will be vasodilation in most of cases. To improve blood supply, right? If we don't have enough oxygen, we can dilate the vessels and get more oxygen. So it's a compensatory mechanism. And on the level of respiratory chain in the cells, there will be also some adaptive compensatory changes, which is increased affinity of respiratory chain enzymes, cytochromes, to oxygen in mitochondria. They will be catching oxygen more effectively, right? So it's the general mechanisms of compensation in case of hypoxia. Here you can see the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve or oxygen binding curve, and it can be shifted to the left and to the right. And it represents the dependence between the saturation of oxygen on the left, you can see, and the level of oxygen in the tissue, right? So the oxygen supply to the tissue. When it's shifted to the right, it means that more oxygen will be given to the tissue. And because of affinity of oxygen to the hemoglobin is decreased, the hemoglobin will easily release the oxygen. If it's shifted to the left, it means that hemoglobin will hold the oxygen and will not release to the tissues, and the tissue level of oxygen will be decreased despite the high saturation, right? So this is a curve, what represents. And you can see the main factors that can make these left or right shifts. A left shift can be observed in case of alkalosis, only in case of high altitude, in case of hypoxia, right? In case of, in terms of hypoxia, according to this topic, example. Decreased concentration of BPG, which is biphosphoglycerate. Biphosphoglycerate is a product of glycolysis inside the erythrocytes, and it regulates the spatial conformation of hemoglobin chains. And if it's high concentration, the conformation will be this way to release oxygen. It will be easier to release oxygen. When we don't have enough BPG, the conformation will be changed and oxygen will be like locked inside the hemoglobin molecule, and that's why the tissue level will be decreased. Also, it's decreased temperature, hypothermia, and some pathological types or physiological different types of additional types of hemoglobin, which is fetal hemoglobin in case of intrauterine period of development, right, during the pregnancy. CO monoxide, carbon monoxide in case of poisoning, and methemoglobin in case of oxidation, as we have mentioned before. So even presence of these types, methemoglobin, carboxyhemoglobin, will will increase affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen, and the oxygen will not be released to the tissues. On another hand, shift to the right, which is good for tissues, can be observed in opposite situations. In case of increased acidity, right, acidosis, increased concentration of BPG, increased temperature, and increased altitude, right? You can see this also here. And it can be explained because in case of a high altitude condition, we will have the hyperventilation and alkalosis, right? And alkalosis in the same time can activate anaerobic glycolysis, and the one of the products of glycolysis will be increased concentration of BPG in the erythrocytes, and it will help them to release more oxygen to the tissue, which is a compensatory mechanism as well, right? Uh, and you can hear this explanation of BPG effects, which is stabilization form of hemoglobin. Okay, let's move on. And we have also delayed compensatory mechanism. I didn't mention, but it was like fast first mechanism of response to hypoxia. And if we have chronic hypoxia, in case of living high in the mountains, right? In case of chronic diseases of respiratory system, chronic heart failure, or chronic anemia, right? We will have the long-term effects or delayed compensatory mechanisms uh, in case of hypoxia. So what are they? They are hypertrophy of respiratory muscles, right? If it was hyperventilation, activation of breathing, and if it's constantly activated, it will be hypertrophy, increased muscular weight of the muscles, right? Also, it will be cardiac hypertrophy, the same idea if the heart should pump more blood, if it's a constant stimulation of the heart by sympathetic nervous system, because we have this chronic hypoxia, it will lead to hypertrophy of the heart. Also, it will be hyperstimulation of bone marrow to produce more erythrocytes. The fast mechanism was release of the blood from the depot, and here we are trying, the body is trying to produce more and more erythrocytes because they can carry oxygen, right? If we have more erythrocytes, we can carry and we can deliver more oxygen to the tissues, which can be helpful, right? So it is a compensatory mechanism as well. And it's chronic or delayed because we need time to produce new erythrocytes, right? Locally, it can be formation of new vessels, neoangiogenesis, right? The formation of new vessels. To if we don't have oxygen supply in this area, we can make new vessel, and it can deliver the oxygen to this ischemic area, right? The area without adequate arterial blood supply. Also on the molecular, on the cellular level, it will be hypertrophy of mitochondria in cells, can be increased number of mitochondria, and they will be enlarged to utilize the oxygen more effectively, right? And also it can be increased expression of glycolysis enzymes and respiratory chain enzymes. Again, for better utilization of oxygen, we need to use all oxygen we have, because in case of lack of oxygen, we need to optimize our utilization system, right? And it will be more enzymes to catch all possible oxygen in case of lack of oxygen, right? And in case of depletion of oxygen, we also need anaerobic glycolysis, right? So all these biochemical processes will be activated in case of chronic hypoxia. Of course, you should understand that it is, if it's severe acute hypoxia, the cell, the tissue can die and the body can die. But if the body or tissue has survived, and then in case of chronic uh, situation of lack of oxygen, chronic hypoxia, all these mechanisms will be switched on and can compensate the situation, right? On the molecular level, we need to understand very important mechanism of oxygen depletion sensing, how our cells understand that there is no oxygen, right? So what are the molecular mechanisms of response to hypoxia. By description of these mechanisms, it was the Nobel Prize awarded to Greg Semenza, I'm sorry, and it's very important for understanding hypoxia in general. So if this is a slide that represents what happens inside the cell. So when we have enough oxygen in the cell, the oxygen will be bonded to the specific protein, which is called hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF1. You can see the abbreviation below of the slide. And it will lead to oxidated form, hydroxylated form. The specific enzyme that provide this reaction is prolyl hydroxylase, PHD, and when we will have hydroxylated HIF factor, it will be destroyed in proteasome, the specific system of protein degradation, right? So constantly, when we have oxygen, it will oxidize the HIF1, and HIF1 will be destroyed. So all the time when we have normal amount of oxygen. When we don't have enough oxygen, we will have the situation that the prolyl hydroxylase will not make hydroxylated HIF and it will not be destroyed. It will remain stable, like without OH groups, you can see hydroxyl groups, and it will go into the nucleus on the left side of the slide, you can see, and act as the transcription factor, switching on the transcription of many genes. For example, the genes that are related to angiogenesis, formation of new vessels, glycolysis, mitophagy, and general survival program, right? So this system is helpful because it's a very fast response to hypoxia. You know that in case of long-term hypoxia, when we have ATP depletion, to produce brand new protein will be very difficult, right, in this situation. And when we have the protein, which is already produced but not destroyed, it will be fast signalization, fast activation of genes and programs of surviving, and the cell will have higher chances to survive in case of oxygen depletion, right? So this is important mechanism for understanding, and if we understand what is happening, we can make some new drugs to prevent the degradation of HIF factor, hypoxia-inducible factor, right? To activate angiogenesis, to activate survival programs in case of some diseases which are characterized by lack of oxygen supply. So what are the effects of the hypoxia-inducible factor? Of course, as I have mentioned, it acts as transcription factor through the hypoxia response elements in our genome. And you can see the main effects on the left slide. It is shift to anaerobic metabolism, increased production of glycolytic enzymes, activation of anaerobic glycolization. If we don't have oxygen, we can produce little portions of ATP by anaerobic glycolization. More glucose transporters to utilize better all glucose to produce more energy again. Vascularization, formation of new vessels, neoangiogenesis, through the VEGF, as I have mentioned before, vascular endothelial growth factor, which will activate the growth of new vessels. Erythropoietin also is also regulated by hypoxia-inducible factor, which will stimulate the bone marrow to produce more erythrocytes to carry more oxygen in case of hypoxia, right? So, and by the way, erythropoietin is produced mainly by cells in the kidneys. They are more sensitive to hypoxia and will produce In case of hypoxia, will produce erythropoietin through the HIF, hypoxia-inducible factor. The erythropoietin will reach bone marrow, activate the erythrocytes' progenitor cells, and activate erythropoiesis. But in case of overexpression, it can lead also to apoptosis, right? If this hypoxia cannot be compensated, because one of the another effects of HIF factor is stabilization of P53, which is a protein related to apoptosis mechanisms, right? And one more effect is activation of production of TGF beta, transforming growth factor beta, which will lead to activation of collagen production by fibroblasts, and it will lead to fibrosis or sclerosis. So another consequence, negative effect, will be sclerotic changes in the tissue and the organs. So if you understand what is hypoxia-inducible factor and how it works, you understand the main negative effects. So what is happening on the cellular level in case of decompensated hypoxia, in case of severe hypoxia, when all our mechanisms, systemic or local mechanism of reaction, compensation are not enough to um, provide normal functioning, provide surviving of cell. Of course, the cell can die and can be injured. So we have ATP depletion because if there is no enough oxygen, there is no aerobic glycosylation, and oxidative phosphorylation will be blocked and we will not have enough ATP. If we don't have ATP, the calcium pumps will not be working properly and we will have calcium overload. And you know that calcium overload will lead to activation of some proteases, some phospholipase, A2, endonucleases, cytoskeletal proteins, and so on. Everything will impair the function of the cell, right? Osmotic mechanism of cell injury also will be observed. It will lead to cell swelling. Again, when we don't have ATP, the sodium-potassium channel will not be functioning properly, and it will lead to the swelling because of accumulation of sodium, and sodium will pull the water because of osmotic effect. Intracellular acidosis is also the result and consequence of ATP depletion. Accumulation of lactate as a result of anaerobic glycolysis will lead to some conformational changes of protein structure as well, because for proper normal functioning, our proteins require some range of pH, meaning so it will change their functioning, and we know that proteins are channels, pumps, receptors, cytoskeletal proteins, some hormones, and so on, right? Enzymes, and the acidosis can change and destroy their functioning. And of course, ATP depletion and lack of oxygen will lead to increase of free radical production, reactive oxygen species mainly, right? When we don't have enough oxygen, the enzymes of respiratory chain will be changed, their conformation, spatial structure, and they will like throw the electron from them. And this electron can be bonded to the oxygen molecule, make it superoxide radical, and superoxide radical can make hydroxyl peroxide, right? Hydrogen peroxide, I'm sorry, and lead to cascades of reactions, chain reactions that will oxidize, destroy lipids, proteins, and DNA. So it will be oxidative stress, which also can damage and lead to necrotic cell death, right? Necrosis, and the cell will be destroyed. Also, it can be apoptosis if we have not so acute but chronic hypoxia, maybe an accumulation of oxidized proteins and damaged DNA can also switch on the program of apoptosis, and it will end it up with cell death, right? Here you can see the scheme that represents lack of oxygen mechanism, a lack of ATP. We will have activation of reactive oxygen species production, lipid peroxidation, and destruction of phospholipid membrane damage, overload with calcium inside the cell, protease activation, cytoskeletal damage, again, phospholipid degradation because of activation of phospholipase A2, and so on. All these mechanisms together can lead to membrane damage and necrotic cell death. One more important syndrome to understand, which is related to hypoxia, is so-called reperfusion syndrome, or it can be named like ischemic reperfusion syndrome. When we had, for example, upper part of the slide, hypoxia or anoxia, total absence of oxygen because of thromboembolism. You can see that thrombus blocked the artery, and cells didn't get a blood supply and oxygen, so they are suffering from hypoxia, and they are swelling, they are damaging, they are being damaged, but they are not dead for now, right? And if in this situation we will restore the blood supply, we will remove the thrombus. It's called reperfusion, right? The renewal of the perfusion, blood supply. We will have more oxygen, more calcium going with new blood to these suffering cells, and we can this blood can kill these cells because of this excessive concentration of oxygen and calcium. And we know that in case of hypoxic injury, we have reactive oxygen species inside the cells, right? So if we put more oxygen, it will be more reactive oxygen species, more damage, and the cell will die faster. So after reperfusion, we are expecting survival, right? That everything will be okay with this ischemic tissue, the tissue that was suffering without oxygen. But in real situation, this area can be damaged more because of oxygen and free radical production and calcium mechanisms of injury mainly. So negative consequences of hypoxia, to sum up general idea, can lead to organ dysfunction if it's again chronic, mild, or moderate hypoxia. It will lead to maybe death of some portion of the cells, right? But another cells can survive. But in general, the organ function will be decreased. Organ dysfunction can be observed, right? So this is called atrophy, right? When we have reduction in cell or tissue mass. We don't have oxygen for all cells, right? So some parts, some number of cells will die, some number of cells will survive. Also, if it's acute hypoxia or severe hypoxia, total lack of oxygen, it can lead to death, necrotic death of the cells, and it's called traditional infarction of the tissue, right? Myocardial infarction, brain infarction, and so on. If it's again chronic hypoxia and we have diminished oxygen supply to the organ, on one hand, we will have atrophic changes. The parenchymal cells will be, the number of parenchymal cells will be decreased. There is not enough oxygen for all cells. Some part of cells will die, right? But we need to substitute, to replace these dead cells with some tissue, and we have like universal replacement for atrophic or dead tissue, which is connective tissue, and it's called fibrosis or sclerosis, right? So the negative consequence and effect of hypoxia is also sclerosis or fibrosis of the organs, nephrosclerosis, cardiosclerosis, and pulmonary sclerosis, so on. And of course, it can be death general, I mean the death of the human body because of systemic severe hypoxia, mainly because of death of brain cells, right? Because they are more sensitive to hypoxia. And Here you can see the example of clinical signs. Clinical signs of hypoxia will depend on the exact type of hypoxia, severity of hypoxia, the period of time of hypoxia, right? So a lot of factors, but one of the most common is cyanosis because of increased concentration of reduced hemoglobin, and in case of decreased saturation, if it's less than 80%, it will be bluish coloring of the skin. It can start from the fingers, from the area around the mouth and nose, and then it can be systemic cyanosis. And speaking about sensitivity to hypoxia, right? We can have more or less susceptible tissues to hypoxia that can be damaged more or less, right? So here are some examples. As I have mentioned, that neurons in the central nervous system in the brain are the most sensitive, and that can the irreversible damage can be observed in 5 minutes after global total hypoxia, right? Especially in the area between distribution of different arteries, middle cerebral and anterior cerebral artery, like watershed areas. Also, it can be subendocardial tissue in the heart, renal cortex and medulla, hepatocytes, and so on. You can see the examples of the most sensitive tissue. And here you can see the organ, the brain, with macroscopic signs of the infarction, this black part in the right hemisphere, which is watershed infarction in the brain, the bit on the measure between two basins of anterior and middle cerebral artery. So I think it's understandable that hypoxia is the most common typical pathological process, and we know that the main types are exogenous, respiratory, circulatory, hemic, histotoxic, and mixed ones. And the main molecular response to hypoxia is a stabilization of hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF, and activation of genes expression to compensate lack of oxygen. Here you can find some references and more information in this topic. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye.